Welcome, listeners, to episode 6 of Snippet Sports Science Podcast. This is Jared Coleman-Stark, today here with Chris Gaviglio, looking at the acute effects of different methods of stretching in specific warm-ups by some Brazilian researchers. What do you think of this, Chris?
This has actually had a nice little practical aspect to it. As a coach, we always look at different ways of improving our performance prior to lifting. And I think there's been lots of different conversations around the effect of stretching and different warm-ups and how that can affect consequent performance. Traditionally, we know not to stretch too much prior to a session, but what those stretches, if we need to, how they do affect performance, I think knowing that is quite important. So traditionally in a warm-up, there's PNF stretching, there's static stretching. Dynamic stretching, yeah. Exactly right. So what they did in this study, they looked at 3 different interventions. One was PNF, the other one was passive static stretching, and then the third intervention was actually just a specific warm-up prior to a strength training session. And that's what they focused on in this study, was actually looking at the effects of performance with 8RM around a strength training session, and also pennation angle and fascicle length. Because one thing that's important to note, that obviously stretching alters both of these components. So for example, the tendon tension during stretching can alter viscoelasticity, causing a stress relaxation behavior that reduces tendon stiffness and therefore affects the force transmitted by the muscles. So that's really important to know. But also the arrangement of the muscle fibers directly relates to muscle force generation. So that it's actually been shown that there's been changes in muscle architecture after acute stretching, and such that decreases in pennation angle and increases in fascicle length, therefore can affect performance. So I think these are really important things to understand, how stretching can affect the architectural rearrangement of the muscles and how that then relates to force production in performance.
Absolutely. Those are very important things for both scientists and practitioners, in my opinion.
Definitely.
If you don't understand the clay, how are you supposed to sculpt something out of it?
Yes, it's a great analogy.
So, how did they go about testing these different interventions?
So, I've discussed the 3 interventions. There was actually a 4th, which was a control. What they did was they took imaging of the muscle fiber through ultrasound. So, to get the subjects to rest, image, put the intervention into place, and then they do their strength session. Their strength session consisted of leg extension, leg curls, leg press, and a hack machine squat, where they focused upon performing 8RM as their test effect.
Okay, and then the stretching as well, was that focused on muscle groups similar to those exercises, or?
Yeah, exactly right. So they performed a hamstring and a quad stretch. So what they did there was they did 3 sets of knee flexion and extension within 30-second intervals as well. So what they do is they'd hold for 6 seconds, 24 seconds off, 3 times through.
Sure. And so those major outcome measures they were looking at were that fascicle length and pennation angle that you were talking about, as well as performance in a repetition task.
Correct, yeah. The amount of reps that they could perform during the session that actually trying to perform reps to fatigue.
Okay, and what did they find with those?
In terms of the stretching outcomes with the reps being able to be performed, PNF actually decreased reps, whereas passive stretching and also a specific warm-up increased reps compared to control. In the specific warm-up, they actually perform more reps than PNF and the control. In terms of actual pennation angle, fascicle length or muscle architecture, the biceps femoris in particular displayed an increase in pennation angle 10 minutes post-strength session for the passive, and also increased fascicle length immediately after passive stretching.
Okay, and why do we think that we had those changes occur? Do we understand the mechanisms that are happening behind those different interventions for warm-up, or is it sort of up in the air at the moment?
Part of the mechanisms that were discussed in the paper was talking about the role of the Golgi tendon organs. In particular, you can actually have a decrease in neural activation by the Golgi tendon organs, which can actually be affected by stretching. In relation to this, there's a autogenic inhibition reflex discharge when high tension is detected in the muscle structure, in the tendon structure. Obviously, with intense stretching, the muscle tension can discharge this reflex, causing muscle inhibition, potentially protecting it from injuries. But they spoke a little bit about the PNF stretching, and they really focused heavily on the Golgi tendon when they actually did that type of stretching. It may have prevented any further muscle elongation in the next stretching phase. It may have had that an inhibitory effect, although temporary. They thought that possibly the change in the stiffness may have affected performance.
Yeah, and just bringing in a little background outside knowledge. For example, PNF can be considered a relatively intense exercise, actually. We know that it causes a significant amount of muscle damage. You're doing a contraction at end range of motion where you're quite weak, and so pretty much any exercise in that position is going to be potentially fatiguing as well.
Yeah, definitely. And going on that, it didn't really allude to the subjects as to how much experience they've had in it. I definitely know that when you do PNF stretching, if you're not used to it, you can actually pull up quite sore from it because you've been told to actually push with an amount of force. So that possibly may have then related to soreness, which may have had another inhibitory effect on consequent strength training performance.
Yeah. Unaccustomed exercise, you get increased muscle damage as well. Exactly. So what are the takeaways from this? How are people going to use this information?
Well, I think there's a nice clean message about what you should do and what you shouldn't do. Specific warm-ups work well. I think we got to limit the amount of passive stretching you do, but I think it gives some nice information to the coach to say that, hey, if your athlete actually has a few major tight areas that need a focus of a stretch, yeah, it's okay. And I actually think, I know definitely in some areas, so like, how the hip flexors can affect glute function. So, I'm quite conscious of if you've got tight hip flexors and you really want to focus on glutes, that I always get athletes to do that prior to the session because I want to ensure that there's good function in their glutes when they're doing, a squat or a lunge or so forth. It really just gives a nice message to say that if you want to do your PNF, your hard range stuff, leave that for after the session. If you want to do any stretching beforehand, yeah, it's okay to be doing a little bit of static stretching, but I think we're all conscious of that we need to limit that. And probably just with a specific warm-up, one thing in terms of performance is just increasing muscle temperature. And that's the idea of a warm-up, is to get the muscles warm. I know it's a simple concept, but I think, we've seen a lot of papers out there highlighting the fact that you really need to increase muscle temp to actually get good gains of performance. So have a good warm-up, make it specific, but if you want to do a little bit of stretching earlier on, that's okay.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. That's a great practical application knowledge there. All right, thank you, listeners. If you'd like to learn more, you can visit our website at snippetscience.com and follow us on Twitter at snippetscience. Thank you.